Hello, and thank you for joining us on Spectator TV, Posie. I think the first question is, given the events of the past week, how are you and what exactly happened on your trip down under?
Oh gosh, what didn't happen on my trip down under? It was a full spectrum of experience, which started with me when I landed in Sydney, saying to my husband, we could move here. It's such a lovely, wonderful, friendly place to, by the end of it, leaving New Zealand with police protection where nobody could even know where I was in the station, and having a police escort until I got on the plane, until the plane took off. So, full spectrum of stuff, mobbing, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously done a number of these kind of events before. You've enlisted reactions, but positive, negative before. I mean, were you surprised by the intensity of feelings which happened on your tour down under?
Um, yes, I was. So I knew it was going to be hostile because we are in a bizarre episode of human history in which normal people that understand the truth are fighting against sort of a quasi-religious authoritarian cult. So I knew that it was going to be difficult. But what normally happens in these situations is you get the people that are part of the cult that will be very, very angry with you and shout dogmatic mantras at you. And that's understandable, and I accept that, and they are almost invited because they prove my point really as to why I don't want them in women only spaces. But once we stepped into calling me a white nationalist, and a Nazi, which was done by people in authority, then I'm fair game just to be killed in the street. So it just took on a totally different feel. And also, I think most people don't want men in their spaces. They don't want men in spaces with their daughters. And so it's unlikely I'm just going to meet some random person on the street that doesn't agree with me. But that's not the case when I'm all over the news on a daily basis, trending on a daily basis as kind of more poisonous than a funnel web spider.
But you mentioned there, talking about going around Australia and New Zealand, and you mentioned in your answer there about those in authority who let you down. Who exactly is to blame there? Because obviously there was a visceral demonstration on the streets, and you talk about in your piece, but for the explanation of those who are watching this, particularly the failings of the police in New Zealand, why do you think this is, and how exactly did they let you down?
Well, I want to just make it really clear that the officers that looked after me in New Zealand were incredible. They were lovely. They are nothing to do with the decision-making process, which basically held back police out of the place where the mobbing happened. I mean, I got taken to the middle of the mob to stand on a bandstand. And when I got there, I had no idea the police weren't there. I just assumed because they said they cooperate. I mean, they said they wanted to know where I was before I got in the country. And so I assumed that meant they were going to protect me, and they took it really seriously because I'd been escorted in a couple of airports by Australian police. But instead, when I got there, I was searched for 2 hours and interrogated. My hotel had already cancelled. And then when I got to the hotel, when I woke up the next day, I had a threatening letter under my door. So I probably shouldn't have been surprised. And I felt it, right? I'm not particularly a spiritual person or believe in those sorts of things, but I felt it in my bones. I was very afraid actually going to the event.
And there was an activist who assaulted you by pouring tomato juice in your head, and then gave a very sort of boastful interview to television before flying to Australia. And then the police said that they wouldn't arrest them. I mean, do you think that you were sort of insufficiently supported against those kind of threats, and that clearly the people who were doing this sort of stuff felt they were empowered to do things such as cover you in tomato juice?
Mm. I think they act as if there's no consequences whatsoever, and to sort of gloat about it, especially when apparently that person has refugee status and now has committed an act of common assault, which, I'm now drinking my soup cold, so I'm quite happy about that. I think there are going to be some consequences, but yeah, the protesters should not have been allowed anywhere near women who just want to speak. I mean, it's been called a counter protest. We are not protesting. We are just gathering to speak. And so there is a protest against women speaking all in every single city we encountered. And it just got worse and worse and worse for how much they were allowed to really terrorize women.
And I mean, Posie, you've done a lot of these kind of overseas tours and around the country as well. I mean, do you get a sense perhaps that the debate on these kind of issues is very different in Australia and New Zealand? And to what extent do you think national leaders, people like Jacinda Ardern, are to blame for clearly the very parlous and dangerous state of political debate down there?
Well, I think we just look to lockdowns, and I think there's a correlation between the authoritarian attitude of those governments in lockdown and what you could force a population to do, and this adherence to this brand new ideology of pretending that we don't know what biological sex is. There does seem to be a correlation. I just don't. It was just so weird to be in a situation that was clearly very dangerous, really violent, could have ended up with any one of us women having our lives taken. And all over placards, there's talking about me dying and being stomped on and exterminated and all of these things. And that shouldn't have even been allowed at all. But lots of nations have been allowing this, whether it's how we protest against world leaders when they come here, more likely to protest Trump than they were somebody who's in a sort of a theo-fascistic kind of authoritarian country. There's something really bizarre going on, and none of it feels real.
A sort of hierarchy of different protests with perhaps uneven standards between all of that.
Yeah.
From the sound of it,
and lies. I mean, the media in New Zealand is nuts. They just lied. I mean, they didn't exaggerate. They didn't just exaggerate. They didn't just extrapolate. They actually lied. They blurred my hand and pretended I was doing a white power signal. They whipped up. I mean, maybe there's no news in New Zealand. Who knows? But they whipped up a frenzy. I was trending in those areas, and I was on the news channels every single night with, serious politicians coming out and lying about me and saying that I was a really dangerous person, and never talking about really any of the issues that the women want to talk about in their countries, just sort of saying that I had these guilt by association relationships with a variety of people that I've never met, never talked to, I've got nothing to do with, and just whipping people up into this frenzy. It's a sight to behold.
You mentioned the women there. What do they tell you? And do they sort of compare your experiences with theirs and sort of comment on the kind of nature of women in political debate in Australia and New Zealand?
Yes. So there's already self-ID in most of Australia. They talk about the sexualization of children, and I saw government literature where it described babies aged 0 to 2 having a sexuality. And talking about babies sort of touching their bodies, being sort of forming their sexual identity. It's truly the worst of everything. Is probably in our Fair Isles is Scotland, and it's worse in Australia and New Zealand than it is in Scotland, and Scotland is pretty bad.
I mean, I think there's often a sort of worldwide trend in these things where it seemed for a long time like most Western democracies were pushing towards self-identification, and now perhaps in recent events you see obviously the backlash to what was happening in Scotland with the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. You've seen the World Athletics Committee come out against sort of elite sport, transgender participation in that. It seems perhaps maybe that there's a kind of pushback or a sort of change in the national mood on these trends. Did you detect anything like that in Australia or New Zealand? Because it sounds as though it was very much the opposite.
Well, it's the same in every country, that it's this weird covert attack on policy before it ever spills out into the public discourse. And that's happened in Australia and New Zealand a lot worse. So before nobody knows what's going on. And New Zealanders and Aussies, they are really, I'm not going to say apathetic because that makes them sound like they don't care, but everything's going to be great in Australia and New Zealand. Everything's fine. Everyone just likes each other and gets on. And so they were ripe, really, for this sort of authoritarian creep, same in Canada, this authoritarian creep where they change all the policies, nobody knows what's going on, and then they just push this sort of coercive manipulation of the population. And most people are still thinking that a man who wants to enter a space, which some people might call a trans woman, I would call a man, but a man wanting to use women's spaces and pronouns and language, etc. A lot of people still think that that is a really vulnerable member of the population who needs looking after and special sort of rights. And the truth is, it isn't a vulnerable member of a population that can have a mob of 2,000 people commit acts of violence against women and not even be condemned. That is not a vulnerable part of our population.
And how has this sort of impacted you? I mean, looking to the future, is it going to change how you conduct these tours, or how you think about them, or how you engage in the public space, or do you remain more resolute than ever? What's your kind of takeaways and lessons from the experiences you went through in Australia and New Zealand?
Well, I'm upping my own personal security, which is frankly expensive. So I'm upping my personal security. Plus, I'm just about to enter politics, and I'm going to go stand against Keir Starmer. So I'm going to be even more known. And I think the attacks upon me are going to be more vitriolic. So that's one thing I'm doing. I think unless we get really good agreements from police when I travel, so I'm supposed to go to Northern Ireland and Ireland. And now that they've upped the terrorism threat in Northern Ireland, I think that would be silly to put women at grave risk. So I won't be doing that. But, you know, I'm going to tell the police in this country that they absolutely have a duty to look after us. Otherwise, what we will do as women is we will stand against every single PCC and we will win. And we will ensure that the police actually look after women and that we're safe to speak in the streets of the United Kingdom.
Thank you for joining us, Posie.